Hey guys, tonight let's do the sensible thing. Dim the lights, put the phone down somewhere safe where it can't bonk you in the face. Maybe stare at the ceiling for a moment and let your brain power down like an overworked factory engine from the 1830s. Because tonight, we're drifting gently into the Industrial Revolution. You know, that thing teachers talk about like it was a motivational poster. Progress, innovation, opportunity, smiling workers, clean brick factories, everyone winning, of course. But as we slowly exhale and get comfortable, we're going to take the long way around the back of the factory, the part they don't put in textbooks, the part that smells weird, the part where the success stories are mostly written by people who never actually worked the machines. So let's begin where all good modern disasters begin, with Britain, late 18th century. Green fields, sheep everywhere, way too many sheep. Britain had been doing this farming thing for centuries, and it was fine. Not exciting, not glamorous, but people survived. They worked with the sun. They went to sleep when it got dark. Radical concept. Then someone had an idea. And as history has shown repeatedly, whenever someone has an idea, everyone else has to suffer for a while. The idea was simple. Why make things slowly by hand when you could make them faster with machines? And why spread those machines out in villages when you could shove them all into one building and call it a factory? Efficiency. Beautiful word. Very dangerous word. Enter steam power, because of course coal was involved. Coal is always involved when things get grim. Britain had coal, a lot of it. Black rocks pulled from the ground by men who never saw sunlight, and children who definitely should not have been underground at all, but we'll get to that. Coal fed steam engines. Steam engines fed machines. Machines fed profits. And profits fed not the workers, not really. The early factories were loud, constantly loud. The kind of loud that doesn't stop, ever. Imagine standing next to a screaming train for 12 hours a day. Now imagine doing that 6 days a week while breathing air thick enough to chew. Welcome to progress. Before this, work had rhythms, seasons, breaks. The Industrial Revolution hated that. Machines do not care about seasons. Machines do not care about your back pain. Machines do not care if your child is sick. Machines want to run, and factory owners were happy to let them. Working days stretched longer and longer. 12 hours became normal. 14 hours wasn't unusual. Sometimes 16, because why not double down? There were no labor laws, no weekends, no safety regulations. If you lost a finger, that was more of a personal problem than a systemic issue. And people did lose fingers, and arms, and sometimes their lives. Machines had exposed gears, spinning belts, no guards, no emergency stops. If your sleeve got caught, the machine did not pause to consider your feelings. It simply continued. Factory owners, meanwhile, developed a fascinating philosophy. They believed accidents were the worker's fault, always. The machine was perfect. The system was perfect. The human was defective. This attitude extended nicely into housing. Because once factories appeared, people flooded into cities. Rural families abandoned farms because farming couldn't compete. Suddenly, cities like Manchester and Birmingham exploded in size, not gradually, instantly. And cities were not ready. Housing went up fast, cheaply. Narrow rows of brick houses packed together like mismatched teeth. No planning, no sanitation, no clean water. Streets filled with waste, human waste, animal waste, industrial waste, sometimes all at once for variety. Clean drinking water was more of a suggestion than a reality. Wells sat dangerously close to sewage pits. Rivers became open sewers, and people drank from them anyway, because thirst is very persuasive. Disease loved this. Cholera absolutely thrived. Typhoid showed up uninvited and stayed far too long. Tuberculosis drifted quietly through overcrowded rooms, claiming people slowly, politely, and efficiently. Factory workers returned home exhausted, only to sleep in single rooms shared by entire families, sometimes with lodgers, sometimes with strangers. Privacy was a luxury. Silence was non-existent. Fresh air was a rumor. And then there were the children. Of course there were children. Factories loved children. Children were small. Children were cheap. Children could crawl under machines. Children could be paid a fraction of an adult wage and still somehow be accused of being lazy. Some children started working as young as 5. 5, barely tall enough to reach the machine they were expected to clean while it was still running, because stopping the machine cost money, and money mattered more than fingers. In textile mills, children worked as scavengers, darting between spinning frames to collect loose cotton. If they moved too slowly, they were beaten. If they moved too fast, they risked getting caught. Either way, it was not a great career path. Education? Optional. And by optional, we mean non-existent. A working child was a profitable child. School did not produce immediate returns. Parents often had no choice. Wages were so low that entire families needed to work just to survive. Children were not protected. They were economic units. And yet, somehow, this was still described as opportunity. Let's float gently upward for a moment, away from the noise, and check in on the people at the top, the factory owners, the industrialists, the men who would later be called captains of industry, which sounds heroic. They preferred it that way. Many started small, a workshop, a few machines, then profits rolled in, and with profits came influence. These men built grand homes far from the factories, fresh air, gardens, quiet. Funny how that worked. They justified everything. Long hours built character. Low wages prevented idleness. Child labor taught discipline. Poverty was a moral failing. Wealth was proof of virtue. Very convenient moral math. Some even believed they were doing workers a favor. After all, factory jobs were better than starving in the countryside, which is technically true in the same way that being slightly less miserable is still miserable. The government mostly agreed with the owners. Early industrial Britain believed in minimal interference, laissez-faire, let the market decide. And the market decided that human suffering was acceptable as long as production increased. When reformers began pointing out problems, they were often dismissed as sentimental or unrealistic, or worse, troublemakers. And yet, the problems were difficult to ignore. Death rates in industrial cities were staggering. Life expectancy dropped. Urban workers often lived shorter lives than medieval peasants. Progress, apparently, had reverse gear. Women worked too. Of course they did. Often in factories, often for even lower wages. Pregnancy did not excuse anyone from work. Children were born. Mothers returned to machines quickly. There was no maternity leave. There was barely rest. In some mills, women were locked inside during shifts to prevent breaks or theft. Fires happened. Doors stayed locked. Outcomes were predictable. And still, production soared. Textiles flooded global markets. British goods dominated trade. Wealth poured into the empire. The Industrial Revolution worked, just not for everyone. Let's slow down here. Take a breath. The machines keep running, but we don't have to. Because this is only the beginning. We haven't even touched the minds yet, or the long-term damage to bodies, or the quiet psychological toll of turning humans into replaceable parts. We're still in the early days, the optimistic days, the days when people still believed the smoke meant success. So settle in. Adjust the pillow. Let the steady rhythm of the machines fade into the background hum of history. And the next part, we'll drift deeper underground where the coal came from and meet the people who paid for steam power with their lungs, their spines, and their lives. But for now, just rest here, in the glow of factory windows, in the age of progress, in the era that promised a better future, eventually. Same position. Same slow breathing, nothing sudden, just a gentle descent. Because if the factories were loud and exhausting, the minds were quieter and worse. Everything about the Industrial Revolution runs on one simple thing: coal. Without coal, there is no steam. No steam, no machines. No machines, no factories. And without factories, none of the very rich people we keep hearing about would have been nearly as rich. So coal mattered. Deeply. Obsessively. Coal came from underground, obviously, which meant people had to go underground to get it, also obviously. And when history needs people to do something miserable and dangerous, it tends to find the most vulnerable ones first. Mining had existed long before the Industrial Revolution, but industrial demand changed everything. Mines went deeper, production increased, timelines tightened, and safety, such as it was, became optional. Early coal mines were cramped, low ceilings, narrow tunnels, damp air, the kind of darkness that presses in on you. Candles were the primary light source, which is comforting when you remember methane gas exists. Explosions happened, cave-ins happened, flooding happened, sometimes all at once just to keep things interesting. Miners worked long shifts underground. 10 to 12 hours was common. Bent over, crawling, hulling coal in baskets or carts, breathing dust constantly. The dust settled in their lungs and never really left. Many miners developed what was politely called miner's lung, which is a gentle phrase for slow suffocation over years. Coughing, weakness, early death, but it was gradual, so it didn't alarm anyone important. And then there were the children. Again, of course. Children worked in mines because adults were expensive and children fit into smaller spaces. Some children were as young as 4 or 5. They worked as choppers, opening and closing ventilation doors in complete darkness, alone for hours. Sometimes they were chained in place so they wouldn't wander off or fall asleep. Other children hauled coal. They dragged heavy carts through narrow tunnels using belts strapped around their waists and chains between their legs. Crawling, always crawling, knees permanently damaged, spines bent before adulthood even had a chance. If a child slowed down, punishment followed. Whippings were common because pain was considered motivational. Public awareness of this came slowly. When it did, people were shocked, temporarily. Committees were formed, reports were written, and then production continued. Eventually, reforms arrived, gradually, carefully, after enough public discomfort. Children were restricted from certain jobs, women too, but enforcement was uneven and loopholes were plentiful. Meanwhile, above ground, cities kept growing. Industrial towns became magnets for labor. People arrived faster than infrastructure could keep up. Overcrowding intensified. Let's gently drift through a typical industrial city street. Narrow, muddy, no pavement, open drains running down the middle, animals wandering freely, waste thrown from windows, air thick with smoke, everything coated in soot. The smell was memorable, a blend of coal smoke, rotting waste, unwashed bodies, and industrial chemicals. People adopted, mostly by pretending it wasn't happening. Water was still a problem. Rivers carried waste from factories and homes alike, but rivers were also used for drinking, washing, and cooking. Cholera outbreaks followed predictable paths. Officials blamed moral weakness or poor character. Germ theory had not arrived yet, so blaming people was easier. Housing conditions barely improved. Tenements packed families together. Rooms rented by the bed, sometimes by shifts. One person slept while another worked. Privacy disappeared. Illness spread quickly. Noise was constant. Sleep became shallow. Exhaustion became permanent. And yet, the system insisted this was progress. Let's check back in with the factory owners and industrial elites, because they were doing great. They invested in railways. Railways moved coal faster. Faster coal meant faster production. Faster production meant more wealth. A very elegant loop. Railways themselves were not gentle creations. Workers laid tracks by hand. Accidents were common. Explosions, falls, crush injuries. Many workers were migrants, easily replaced. Railway travel was hailed as revolutionary, and it was. It collapsed distance, it connected markets. It also mangled bodies when things went wrong. Industrial wealth reshaped society. New social classes emerged. The industrial bourgeoisie rose quickly. Old aristocracies felt threatened. Tensions simmered. Workers began to organize, slowly, quietly at first. Trade unions formed. Demands were modest, shorter hours, safer conditions, slightly better pay, reasonable things. The response was not warm. Unions were often illegal. Strikes were broken by force. Leaders were arrested, sometimes transported, sometimes worse. The message was clear. Stability mattered more than fairness. Still, resistance grew, because when people are exhausted and hungry long enough, they eventually stop being polite about it. We'll pause here again. Let the dust settle. The mines keep breathing out coal. The cities keep swelling. The machines keep humming. In the next part, we'll drift through bodies instead of buildings. The physical cost, the twisted spines, the missing limbs, the quiet medical disasters no one wanted to document too closely. For now, stay comfortable. Let the darkness remain theoretical. You're not underground. You're just listening. The steam hasn't reached full pressure yet. Let's keep going. No rush. The machines certainly aren't in a hurry, but we don't need to match their enthusiasm. Just settle back into the rhythm. In, out. Nice and slow. By now, the Industrial Revolution is running smoothly. Too smoothly, really. Factories are producing at impressive rates. Cities are growing. Coal is burning. And human bodies are quietly breaking down in ways that don't look dramatic enough to cause concern. Because one of the strangest features of industrial progress is how normal injury became. Losing a finger wasn't a tragedy. It was an inconvenience. Losing a hand was unfortunate, but manageable. Losing an arm was, well, at least you still had the other one. This was the scale people worked on. Employers didn't panic when accidents happened. They planned for them. Machines were fast. Humans were slower. This mismatch caused predictable outcomes. Spinning frames caught hair, long hair, loose sleeves, dangling aprons. Workers were pulled in before they had time to react. Scalping happened. Entire arms were torn away. Sometimes the machine didn't even stop afterward. Production mattered. There were no compensation systems, no insurance. If you were injured, you were dismissed. If you could no longer work, you were no longer useful. This was not considered cruel. It was considered practical. Hospitals existed, but they were not comforting places. Surgery was brutal. Anesthesia was limited or non-existent. Amputation was the solution to many problems. Fast cuts, quick decisions. Survival was a bonus. Doctors worked quickly because infection was common. Cleanliness was not yet a priority. Germs were a theoretical concept. Pain was expected. Screaming was normal. Recovery was uncertain. Workers returned to factories injured and exhausted. Some wrapped stumps in cloth and continued. Others shifted to lighter tasks. Many were simply replaced. Children who were injured grew into adults already damaged. Bent spines, chronic pain, breathing problems. Bodies aged faster than time intended. Let's drift for a moment into the concept of rest, or rather, the lack of it. The industrial workday erased natural pauses. There was no stopping when tired. The machine dictated pace. Falling behind meant punishment, whippings, fines, docked wages, dismissal. Factories fined workers for being late. They fined them for talking. They fined them for mistakes. Wages were already low. Fines made them lower. Somehow, this was still called employment.
Fatigue led to mistakes. Mistakes led to injuries. Injuries led to poverty. Poverty led to desperation. And desperation kept people compliant. A very efficient cycle. Let's not forget the psychological side, because while bodies broke visibly, minds eroded quietly. Pre-industrial work had variety. Farming changed with seasons. Craft work involved skill. Industrial labor was repetitive. One motion, all day, every day, for years. Some workers described feeling less human over time, like extensions of machines, replaceable, invisible. There was little sense of progress or pride. You did not see the finished product. You saw your station, one task, forever. Alcohol became popular, very popular. Gin consumption soared. Drinking dulled pain, physical and emotional. Employers disapproved publicly and benefited privately, because exhausted, numb workers complained less. Home life suffered. Exhaustion followed people back to overcrowded rooms. Tempers shortened. Domestic violence increased. Children learned stress early. And still, the narrative remained positive. Newspapers celebrated innovation. Exhibitions displayed machines as marvels. Visitors admired polished engines and clean factory floors prepared especially for them. Workers were kept out of sight. Let's gently shift focus to women, because industrial labor did not discriminate in its appetite. Women worked in textile mills, factories, workshops, often for lower pay, always for long hours. Pregnancy did not excuse absence. Women worked until labor began, sometimes literally. Children were born near machines. Mothers returned to work quickly because families needed wages. Childcare was improvised. Older siblings watched younger ones. Sometimes children stayed in factories. Sometimes accidents happened. Often. Women faced additional risks: harassment, abuse, power imbalance. Complaints rarely went anywhere. And yet, women were blamed for social decay, for poor parenting, for moral decline, despite having almost no control over their circumstances. Let's pause again. Just a moment. The steady hum is still there, but we're floating above it. By the early 19th century, even the most optimistic observers were starting to notice that something wasn't quite right. Cities were unhealthy. Workers were exhausted. Children were alarmingly small and frequently injured. Death statistics were becoming awkwardly difficult to ignore. So, naturally, Britain responded the only way it knew how, with committees. Parliament formed inquiries. Gentlemen toured factories. They took notes. They asked questions. They nodded gravely. Then they went home to houses far away from the smoke. Reports were written. Very detailed reports. They described children chained in mines, 12-hour shifts, deformed bodies, early deaths. The language was polite, concerned, carefully unemotional. Public reaction followed a familiar pattern: shock, outrage, and then hesitation. Reform was discussed as a moral issue, but also as an economic risk. Limiting working hours might reduce profits. Regulating factories might slow growth, and slowing growth was considered almost sinful. Eventually, laws appeared, the Factory Acts. They sound impressive, they sound decisive. They were neither. Early factory legislation focused on children, not because adults mattered less, but because children made people uncomfortable. Children under a certain age were restricted from work. Then that age was adjusted. Then exceptions were added. Working hours were limited, on paper. Enforcement was another matter. Inspectors were few, factories were many, owners were creative. Some factories simply altered records. Some moved children to night shifts. Some reclassified workers. Compliance existed mostly in theory. Mine reforms followed a similar path. Women and very young children were banned from underground work. Public relief followed, then quiet adaptation. Families lost income. Alternatives were scarce. Reformers celebrated progress. Owners complained. Workers adjusted. The system absorbed the changes and continued. Let's pause briefly with the reformers themselves. Many were genuinely concerned. Some had witnessed conditions firsthand. Others were motivated by religious conviction. Moral duty mattered. But even reformers framed their arguments carefully. They spoke of efficiency, of long-term productivity, of healthier workers being better workers. Compassion alone was rarely persuasive. Education entered the conversation. Child labor reform suggested schooling instead of factory work. Schools appeared, slowly, inconsistently. Attendance was irregular. Families still needed wages. Schooling also carried moral expectations, discipline, obedience, punctuality, industrial values just in smaller chairs. Meanwhile, factory discipline remained strict. Bells controlled time, whistles marked shifts. The clock replaced the sun. Workers were expected to internalize punctuality. Being late was a moral failing. Time became currency. Let's float outward again, beyond Britain, because the Industrial Revolution did not stay put. Other countries watched closely. France, Germany, the United States. They admired British productivity. They copied British methods. They imported machines. They often imported the same mistakes. Industrialization arrived with similar patterns: rapid urbanization, poor housing, long hours, child labor. Familiar problems translated into new languages. Governments responded similarly, slowly, carefully, after enough unrest. Speaking of unrest, labor movements grew stronger. Strikes increased, demands expanded. Workers wanted dignity, safety, a life outside factories. Authorities responded with suspicion. Strikes threatened order. Order mattered more than comfort. Some protests turned violent. Most did not. Most were simply desperate, hungry people asking for limits. Gradually, reforms accumulated. Shorter hours, safety measures, compensation laws. None revolutionary on their own, collectively meaningful, eventually. But reform did not undo damage already done. Generations carried injuries, poor health, limited education, poverty lingered. And the narrative shifted. The Industrial Revolution was now described as a success story with rough edges, necessary suffering, the price of progress. Let's sit with that for a moment. Necessary. For whom?
By the mid-19th century, something subtle had happened. The Industrial Revolution had stopped being new. It had become normal. And once something becomes normal, it stops asking permission. Factories no longer felt like an intrusion. They felt inevitable. The most important shift wasn't mechanical. It was psychological. Work was no longer something you did when it needed doing. It was something you organized your entire life around. Time changed. Before factories, time was flexible. Sunrise mattered. Seasons mattered. Tasks expanded or contracted as needed. Industrial work replaced all of that with the clock. Precise, unforgiving, indifferent. Factory bells told people when to wake up, when to eat, when to work, when to stop. Eventually, people didn't need the bell anymore. They learned to hear it in their heads. Being late became a character flaw. Efficiency became a virtue. Stillness became suspicious. This mindset followed workers home. Leisure needed justification. Rest felt earned only through exhaustion. Doing nothing became uncomfortable. Parents passed these values to children: punctuality, obedience, productivity. Schools reinforced them: rows of desks, bells, schedules, training for factory life, even when the factory wasn't obvious. Even reformers supported this shift. Education was framed as preparation for work. Moral improvement meant becoming reliable. Let's drift gently into the idea of respectability, because this mattered a great deal. An industrial society divided people into categories: respectable workers, idle poor,
deserving and undeserving. If you were poor but working constantly, you were tolerable. If you were poor and unemployed, you were suspect. Poverty became a personal failure rather than a structural outcome. This belief was incredibly useful. It allowed society to ignore systemic problems while feeling morally upright. It justified low wages. It explained away suffering. People weren't trapped, they just weren't trying hard enough. Workhouses embodied this philosophy. Workhouses were designed to be unpleasant, intentionally. Conditions were harsh to discourage reliance. Families were separated. Diets were minimal. Labor was monotonous. The message was clear. Poverty should hurt. Many people entered workhouses temporarily. Some stayed longer. Some never left. Children grew up inside them, learning early that survival came with conditions. Outside, industrial cities kept evolving. New technologies appeared. Gaslighting, improved machinery, rail networks expanded. Life became faster. Information traveled quicker. Expectations rose. But wages didn't always keep pace. Living costs increased. Housing remained crowded. Stress persisted. Industrial discipline shaped emotions too. Anger had to be controlled. Sadness suppressed. Fatigue ignored. Feelings interfered with productivity. This emotional restraint became cultural. Stoicism was praised. Complaining was weakness. Even leisure became organized, scheduled, structured. Approved activities replaced spontaneous ones. Time off was managed carefully. Religion adapted as well. Sermons emphasized hard work, patience, endurance, rewards later, always later. And so the factory extended its reach into homes, schools, churches, mines. You didn't need chains when habits worked just as well. Let's rest here for a moment. The idea is heavy, but we're holding it gently. In the next part, we'll look at the long shadow this cast: generational damage, health outcomes, why industrial life aged people quickly and followed families across decades. Let's continue. Same calm pace, no urgency, just a slow drift forward. Because the effects of the Industrial Revolution didn't end when the workday did. They followed people home, and then followed their children. By the late 19th century, industrial societies had settled into themselves. The worst excesses were softened. Some safety rules existed. Working hours shortened slightly. Reformers congratulated themselves. But bodies remember things longer than laws do. Generations of industrial workers carried physical damage that never made headlines. Shortened life expectancy wasn't dramatic enough to be shocking. Chronic pain wasn't exciting. Breathing problems didn't look revolutionary. People aged early. A 40-year-old factory worker often looked closer to 60. Teeth were lost young. Joints stiffened. Lungs struggled. Fatigue settled in permanently. Children born into industrial cities were smaller on average. Malnutrition was common. Diets relied on cheap, filling foods: bread, potatoes, tea, calories without nutrients. Illness spread easily through overcrowded housing. Tuberculosis lingered quietly, claiming people over years. Rickets bent growing bones. Development suffered. Doctors noticed patterns but lacked solutions. Public health reforms came slowly. Clean water systems, sewers, waste management, all expensive, all debated. Again, change happened when it became impossible to ignore. Mental health, though not named as such, suffered too. Exhaustion became normal, anxiety constant, depression unremarkable, emotional numbness useful. Families passed down coping strategies. Endure, don't complain, work harder. Children learned early that security depended on productivity. Education helped some escape. Many stayed where they were. Social mobility existed, but it was limited. Success stories were celebrated loudly. Failures were quiet. Industrial cities developed identities, pride mixed with hardship. Communities formed around factories. When factories closed or moved, entire neighborhoods collapsed. Migration spread industrial patterns globally. Colonies supplied raw materials. Factories elsewhere mirrored earlier mistakes. The system exported itself efficiently. Let's pause gently with the idea of inevitability, because this is how the story is often told. The suffering was unfortunate but unavoidable. The progress was worth it. The modern world required sacrifice. That framing is convenient. It suggests there were no choices, no alternatives, no moments where profit outweighed well-being deliberately. History rarely works that way. Industrialization could have happened differently, slower, safer, more humane. It simply wasn't as profitable. So damage accumulated, quietly, persistently. Even today, traces remain. Work schedules, productivity metrics, burnout. The feeling that rest must be justified. We still measure worth in output. We still praise endurance. We still admire exhaustion. The factory is cleaner now. Louder arguments are discouraged, but the logic remains. Let's rest here for a moment. Nothing needs to be solved tonight.
Same softness, same unhurried movement. Because by the time we reach this part of the story, nothing dramatic is happening anymore. And that, in its own way, is the point. Once the Industrial Revolution had finished breaking people in, it did something very clever. It rebranded itself. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, factories were no longer shocking. Smoke was familiar. Noise was normal. Long hours were expected. What once felt extreme now felt routine. History writers began smoothing things out. Textbooks talked about innovation, about growth, about invention. Steam engines, railways, mass production. All true, all impressive. They also talked about hardship, but briefly, as a phase, as something overcome. Suffering became transitional, necessary, temporary. Workers appeared as a collective blur, anonymous, resilient, rarely named. Individual pain did not photograph well. Industrialists, on the other hand, received biographies, portraits, statues. Their ambition was praised, their wealth framed as evidence of brilliance. Museums displayed machines lovingly restored, polished, silent, clean. The danger was gone, the injuries invisible. Visitors admired craftsmanship. Children pressed noses to glass. No one coughed from coal dust anymore. This selective memory was comforting. It allowed society to celebrate progress without lingering guilt. The phrase, "it was a different time," did a lot of work. Let's sit with that idea gently. It suggests that people didn't know any better, that cruelty was accidental, that suffering simply happened. But we've already seen that people did know. Reports existed. Complaints were loud. Reforms were resisted. Forgetting was not ignorance, it was convenience. As living standards slowly improved for some, distance grew between generations. Grandchildren did not experience the same conditions. Stories softened, details faded. Hardship turned into character-building anecdotes. Your great-grandfather worked in the mills, full stop. No mention of the cough or the missing fingers. National pride absorbed industrial history. Factories meant strength. Output meant power. Empires ran on production. Criticism became unpatriotic. Dwelling on suffering felt ungrateful. Even academic history adopted this tone. Charts replaced stories. Data replaced bodies. And yet traces remained in working-class neighborhoods, in health disparities, in family habits.
Some communities never fully recovered. When industries declined or moved, jobs vanished. Skills tied to obsolete machines lost value. Towns emptied quietly. The Industrial Revolution did not promise permanence, only usefulness. Let's gently widen the lens one more time. Modern society inherited this framework: productivity as virtue, growth as goal, human cost as acceptable margin. We talk about burnout now, about stress, about work-life balance. New words for old patterns. The difference is presentation. The factories are cleaner, the work is quieter, the pressure is internal. We don't need overseers, we monitor ourselves. History rarely announces when it repeats, it just adjusts the lighting. Let's rest here. Nothing needs to resolve tonight.
Let's keep drifting. Nothing sharp ahead. Just a long, quiet glide. Because by this point in the story, the Industrial Revolution has stopped feeling like history and started feeling like background noise. That's because, in many ways, it never actually ended. The factories didn't disappear, they evolved. Some grew cleaner, some moved farther away, some were renamed offices, some became warehouses with better lighting and worse posture. The logic stayed. Work is still measured in hours. Output still defines value. Rest still requires explanation. We no longer hear steam engines, but we hear notifications. We no longer punch time cards, but we check clocks obsessively. The overseer doesn't stand nearby anymore. He lives quietly in our heads. This inheritance wasn't accidental. Industrial discipline proved effective. It produced results. It scaled easily. So it spread. Management theories emerged, efficiency studies, time motion analyses. Every movement measured, every pause questioned. Frederick Taylor would eventually show up and make everything worse, but that's another bedtime story. The language softened. Workers became employees. Exploitation became optimization. Exhaustion became dedication. The idea that work should dominate identity settled in comfortably. Asking what you do became shorthand for asking who you are. Let's slow down here. Let that sit. This wasn't inevitable. It was learned, passed down, reinforced. The Industrial Revolution trained societies to tolerate discomfort in exchange for growth, to delay rest, to accept imbalance, to believe the future would eventually make it worthwhile. That future keeps moving. We see echoes everywhere: shift work, gig labor, surveillance disguised as metrics, productivity apps that monitor sleep, ironically. Health discussions now include burnout, stress, anxiety, new labels for familiar fatigue. And yet, solutions are often individual. Meditate more, sleep better, manage time. The system remains politely untouched. Let's be gentle with this observation. No need for outrage tonight, just awareness. History doesn't repeat exactly. It adapts. It modernizes. It updates its interface. The Industrial Revolution taught the world how to extract value efficiently, from land, from resources, from people. It also taught the world how to justify it. Progress requires sacrifice. Growth demands endurance. Rest can wait. Those ideas still circulate, quieter now, more refined. And yet, here you are, listening, resting, doing something unproductive on purpose. That would have confused a 19th century factory owner deeply. Let's begin easing toward the end. No conclusions, just a soft landing. All right,
This is the last stretch. Nothing to solve, nothing to summarize, just a gentle slowing down, because history doesn't need a conclusion to stop talking. It just needs quiet. The Industrial Revolution didn't end with a ceremony. There was no moment where someone turned off the last engine and announced that humanity could relax again. It simply blended into everything else, into schedules, into expectations, into habits that stopped feeling historical. Most people who lived through it never called it a revolution. They called it work. They woke up tired. They went where they were told. They did what was required. They went home and tried to recover enough to do it again. Progress was something other people talked about. When they aged out of usefulness, the system rarely noticed. New workers arrived, younger, cheaper, less worn down. Families adapted, stories shortened, pain became background noise. History later stepped in and made things neat. Timelines, dates, inventions, a success story with footnotes. But lived experience doesn't organize itself that way. It drifts, it repeats, it settles into routine. And that may be the most lasting legacy of all. The Industrial Revolution taught societies how to normalize imbalance, how to accept exhaustion as ordinary, how to postpone rest indefinitely. It also taught people how to endure quietly without recognition. That endurance doesn't show up in museums. If you listen closely, though, it's still there, in phrases we use, in pride taken in being busy, in guilt felt during rest. None of this needs judgment tonight. Awareness is enough. The machines that once filled cities with smoke are mostly gone, replaced by quieter systems, cleaner processes, better branding. But the rhythm remains. Work, recover, repeat. And occasionally, pause. That's what this moment is. A pause. You're not producing anything. You're not optimizing. You're not advancing history. You're just here. That would have been unthinkable to a 19th century factory owner. Possibly suspicious. Definitely unproductive. And yet, here we are. So let the factories fade back into the past where they belong. Let the bells go quiet. Let the clock loosen its grip for a little while. History has said enough for tonight. There's nothing left to prove, nothing left to finish. Just rest. Good night.